Hello, I'm Stephen Cole, and welcome to the Answers Project podcast from CGTN Europe, where we try and find answers, or at least make sense of, some of the trickiest questions facing us in an increasingly complicated world. We've got access to some of the best brains on the planet to see if they can help shed light on some of the most pressing social, ethical, scientific, geopolitical, and philosophical quandaries. And I'm joined by Mhairi Beveridge, who's going to help me unravel this week's question. So Mhairi, what are we asking this week?
Well, Stephen, today we are asking, should countries be banned from exporting their waste?
A very big and controversial question, Mhairi.
I know, it is, and it doesn't sound that sort of sexy or exciting, but it's actually really, really important.
Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly do my own recycling. I even read the packaging and certainly check if it's put in the recycling bin or throw in the rubbish bin. And so does the current Mrs. Cole as well. And we have even started composting food waste.
That's great, Stephen, but even with all your composting and recycling, it's still a problem, and it's a problem that's not going away anytime soon, especially with a staggering 7.8 billion of us inhabiting this planet. And in fact, without urgent action, the World Bank estimates that global waste production will rise by 70% by 2050. That means if we carry on the way we're going, we will be generating 3.4 billion tonnes of waste each year by then.
That's an alarming figure, because you said almost 3.5 million tonnes.
Billion tonnes.
Oh, billion tonnes.
I actually tried to find a way of visualising this for our listeners, but the number is just too enormous to try and conceive in your mind's eye. It's the equivalent weight of about 32 million blue whales. Do you think that helps at all with imagining the amount of waste we're talking about?
Well, no, it doesn't really. But that really is a very big mound of rubbish.
Now, we could talk about the global waste problem, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and get ourselves very depressed. But the real question I want to focus on, and I guess we're looking at today, is whether the most wasteful nations should be allowed to send all their waste to poorer nations to get rid of it, and without asking them too many questions about what happens to it when it gets there. I spoke to a number of experts in the field, and here are a few of them.
We have to make international agreement on the ban of plastic waste, because to export to another countries like Turkey, Malaysia also, such countries don't deserve to be dumping site for other countries.
Should countries take more responsibility for the material and the quality of it that they're exporting? Yes, of course they should. And should importing countries take more responsibility for the material that they're buying? Yes, of course they should. And it's about supply chain responsibility.
Waste has a value for some or many importing countries in developed world. So clean waste, sorted waste can also have a benefit for certain countries that do not have a production of numerous products.
We've seen so many illegal waste shipments, so many illegal fires and dumping of waste in the receiving countries, because either it's not properly controlled or because the label put on the container of the waste being shipped is wrong, and so there is a need to have strong limitations.
Some really interesting and, I think, thought-provoking comments there. I understand the point about some countries not wanting to be the dumping ground for other countries' waste, but recycling other people's waste can also be, well, quite lucrative. I personally think we have to export our waste to other countries. That's the only viable thing to do, with the added proviso of proper regulations in place, of course.
Well, whether or not it's lucrative has actually been debated, and fundamentally, I'm not sure we should be sending tons of waste thousands of miles away to recycle, essentially giving our rubbish a carbon footprint.
OK, well, let's have a look at some examples. What sort of waste do we export here in the UK, for example?
So a lot of raw materials or commodities. One man who knows a lot about this is Simon Ellin. His organisation represents more than 80 recycling organisations across the UK, which produce more than 2 million tonnes of recyclable materials a year and have a combined annual turnover of more than £2 billion, which is $2.6 billion.
My name is Simon Ellin, Chief Executive of the Recycling Association, a trade body for the recycling industry, what I always call the hard, dirty end of things.
Well, he said recycling was boring. Now, interestingly, when I asked Simon for more information about this type of waste that's exported from the UK, he told me that none of his colleagues are allowed to use the W word because it has such negative connotations.
Well, from the UK, we export several different types of waste, albeit I never refer to it as waste. In fact, we've banned the term waste in our organisation because we very much see it as a commodity, as a raw material, which is very circular in nature. But we are significant exporters of paper and board. About 60% of everything we collect gets exported. And we're significant exporters too of plastics, and about 70%, certainly of plastics packaging, we export. And we also export, very historically, scrap metal, cans in particular, glass, textiles. So, in varying degrees, we are significant exporters of lots of the materials that we collect.
I mean, the old adage in the north of England is, where there's muck, there's money, and one man's rubbish is another man's treasure. In the old days, Mhairi, we had rag and bone men. Guys would come round the streets on a horse and cart and take all your old stuff away and sell it for scrap or upcycle it. So that's very 21st century. The most famous, I think, situation comedy on British television for 20 years, pulling in millions and millions of viewers, was about two rag and bone men, Steptoe and Son. But they certainly wouldn't have been in the export business. And did I get that right, Mhairi? We export an awful lot of our waste overseas?
Yes, when you work it out, it's around 2/3 of our plastic waste.
And that's an incredible amount. I had no idea. I know we're an island. Does that really give us, I suppose, a let-out, an excuse? And where do we sit among other countries in Europe, for example?
Well, it depends on what type of waste you're looking at. But in terms of plastic waste, yes, the UK, Germany, France and the Netherlands are some of the biggest exporters. Globally, the European Union is the largest exporter of plastic waste. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the US leads as the top exporter for a single country.
So where does most of our plastic, the UK's plastic waste imports, end up?
That changes according to supply and demand, but like all business, it's about making a profit. Basically, if it's cheaper to send your rubbish abroad, then send it abroad. You may know we used to send a lot of our plastic rubbish to China.
The dynamic of where we export to is changing. Historically, Asia and particularly China have been big purchases of our material. Particularly with China, it's very, very circular because China are delivering lots and lots of goods to the UK in containers, all in cardboard boxes, all wrapped in plastic, etc. And a lot of the time, we're sending the material back from where it started. So it's very circular in nature. But for self-sustainability reasons and other environmental factors, China are stopping collections, so that market has gone. But we also export elsewhere into Asia, notably India, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and some new markets opening up. For example, Myanmar. And the other major area that we export to, and it's increasing significantly, and partly due to the China factor, is into Europe, particularly Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, France, Belgium, occasionally maybe for as far south as Spain, depending on market conditions, although it's a little bit too far to take it on a trailer. So pretty much globally is the answer.
That's very clear there. I mean, lots of places want to process our waste, even if China doesn't want to anymore.
Yes, I mean, there was a global drawing in of breath when China announced its national sword policy in 2018, turning away plastic and other recyclables. And there wasn't a lot of notice.
Now, without that notice, what did we do? Burn it, I suppose, which produces that horrible acrid smoke, put it in landfills. I'm guessing that when countries announce a ban on certain imports, a lot more plastics end up in places they shouldn't really be until they can find a new destination for it. And as you said, it's a business, and one man's rubbish is another man's treasure.
You say that, but I'm not sure I completely agree with you entirely. I mean, I might have done before these interviews, exporting waste used to serve a purpose to help poorer countries make money, but it's kind of reached a tipping point now. I think it's gone too far, and some countries have become dumping grounds, like Turkey, for example. The UK sends more plastic waste there than to any other country at the moment.
But presumably there are rules now about how it's processed.
Well, you'd hope so, but not always. Professor Sedat Gundogdu is a marine biologist and a hashtag BreakFreeFromPlastic member, and he lives in Adana in the south of Turkey. His focus has been on microplastics getting into the river and the sea near where he works, and he's discovered that some of the waste sent to Turkey for recycling has instead been incinerated or burned, and this is having huge ramifications for the environment and for people's health.
I discovered 10 different illegal dumping sites around the city. There are too many plastic waste imported from European countries, just abandoned and dumped there, and then some of them are burned, some of them are close to the canals, and then these canals, the farmers using water coming from those canals for irrigation, and then some of the canals just ends up in a lagoon environment, home to green sea turtles and flamingos. And now if you go there, then you will find too many European waste.
That's very shocking indeed.
And I'm afraid there is worse news to come. When I spoke to Professor Gundogdu, he had just returned from one of the illegal dumping sites, and he'd brought some of the trash that he'd found, he brought it home with him.
I can give some example. In my hand now, Ashfield chicken thighs, 100% British. The second one belongs to company Lidl. Chicken breast fillets from Asda. This is also 100% British. So I can give many examples of such waste, but we can say that all the companies and brands in UK produce waste, and all this waste have potential to export to Turkey.
How do you feel knowing packaging from your Asda chicken thighs are in the pristine lands of southern Turkey, Stephen?
Well, horrible, obviously. I mean, I wouldn't like to think the packaging from any of my food is in the sea or in those lovely lands of southern Turkey. If it's absolutely true, it's shameful. But I presume it wasn't just UK packaging, Mhairi.
No, it wasn't. He'd also found waste from lots of different countries at these illegal dumping sites. And the UK is just one of them. The rubbish came from other parts of Europe and as far away as Israel, New Zealand, and also the US.
So is that illegal? I mean, how is that happening, Mhairi? This recycling could belong, of course, as you said, to you or me. When we recycle our plastic packaging, when I put it in the green box in our hallway, we expect it, when it's sent away, to be recycled properly, not to be dumped and become another country's problem.
Well, exactly. And let's say, for example, you throw your plastic packaging from your dinner last night in the recycling bin. It will get picked up by your council's contractor and it will be sorted at some kind of materials recovery facility in the UK. It will then be sold on and might be exported to a country like Turkey. The majority of times, your plastic packaging will be recycled and turned into plastic pellets at one of Turkey's official recycling centres, where everything is properly tracked and monitored. But there is a chance it might fall into the hands of small illegal recycling operators who simply dump or burn the waste on the side of the road.
OK, so basically it's up to Turkey to make sure that it's not happening, and perhaps they should be tightening their regulations.
It's very difficult to properly police, though. I mean, up until now, Professor Gundogdu says that the Turkish government hasn't really prioritised the waste issue, and other countries have taken advantage of that. But the Turkish government is now introducing some new measures. The government has reduced the amount that recycling companies can import to half of their own domestic products, which is a move in the right direction. But it's not going to eradicate the problem altogether. I mean, it's certainly not all Turkey's fault, though. Other countries like the UK have to accept some responsibility for the waste they're sending over and ensure it's not falling into the wrong hands before it even reaches Turkey. I asked Professor Gundogdu if he thought countries should be banned from exporting their waste and polluting other people's environments.
Definitely, yes. We should ban waste export or import activities, because if you have your own waste, you have to deal with your own waste to export to another countries where it hasn't any effective waste management system, like Turkey, is not fair.
He told me Turkey can't cope with processing its own waste safely, let alone everyone else's. And he was emphatic that wealthier countries had to stop passing the buck to the world's poor to clean up their rubbish, basically.
you have to focus on the reduction of your own waste. If you reduce your waste production capacity, then all waste that produced by countries could be manageable. If you export your waste to the poor or underdeveloped countries, we can say that this is not a waste export or waste trade. This is definitely waste imperialism or waste colonialism.
Yeah, you see, I of course applaud Professor Gundogdu's investigation into the illegal dumping and incineration of waste, but I think it's completely idealistic to think that countries will stop or can stop exporting their waste. Turkey is a growing country economically, and they probably need the raw materials or commodities, for example, the paper and the plastics, to make new goods for which perhaps, well, they certainly don't have those resources themselves.
Possibly, but I think the bigger question is, why can't those of us in the rest of Europe deal with our own waste in our own countries?
Because that's the nature of business. Countries have their own businesses native to those countries. Now, I was hoping you might make some excuses for the UK. We're an island after all. We don't have that much space.
No, I'm not giving us a pass. You know, spare a thought for the really, really small islands and countries. It's just not viable to build a state-of-the-art recycling facility if you don't have the budget or that much waste to make it cost-effective. I spoke to Andy Street, who's an international waste management consultant and has dedicated the best part of the last 30 years to assisting islands with their recycling. Andy told me about some of the issues which remote islands in particular face, such as coming up with an effective waste strategy when you're so isolated and deciding whether to export waste a long distance at such a high cost.
The other challenge that islands face, of course, often is, depending on the population, is the size of the economy in relation to the cost of putting in place their own solution. Certainly one that is looking to achieve as sustainable approach as possible. Obviously, everyone would support recycling materials as much as possible, moving organics out of the waste stream and reducing the amount of real waste, residual waste as we call it, for some other means of treatment or disposal. Of course, if you're an isolated island, the ability to which you can create local markets for either recyclable products or for organics in terms of turning them into usable compost or whatever that might be, is going to be limited. So scale of economy, scale also of local markets is a challenge.
So I presume if they don't have an economy of scale, they have to burn the waste or put it in landfill.
Well, Andy worked with the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, which takes 5 days to get to from South Africa or South America.
The isolated island thing is that even though, it was a small island, small population, and we ended up, in fact, continuing landfilling a lot of the waste, because you can only use a certain amount of recycled materials, and there's only so much agriculture that will use compost from waste-derived materials. So some would say landfill, that's not a very advanced way of doing it. Well, it wasn't big enough to justify thermal processing, so the obvious solution actually was to do proper engineered landfill. And indeed, the cost effectiveness of exporting anywhere, let alone South Africa or South America, would be ridiculous, because it takes 5 days, very expensive, and you simply couldn't justify it from an economic or environmental perspective. The carbon implications of taking it by boat are far less than the carbon implications of putting it into a landfill, a properly engineered landfill.
So you can do landfill carefully without letting the really, really nasty stuff leach out into the ground. But, I've seen the waste issue on islands in my lifetime. And as you know, I grew up in Brunei in the 90s. And every month my family and I would visit this tiny, beautiful island off the coast of Borneo called Kruman Island, where we would dive and snorkel and whatever. And it was really, really popular with expats and divers, and it was totally pristine. And we went back there as a family in 2017, and it was just totally heartbreaking. And, I had this picture of this pristine island in my mind that we were going to be returning to, that I would go to all the time as a child. And, we could hardly even pull our boat up to the shore because of how much plastic there was surrounding the island. And walking across the island, we were wading through plastic that had obviously been there for over a decade now. And there were a few fishermen there who lived locally as well, and they said nearly everything was dead in the area. It was awful.
That is horrible, and it's only, I think, when you see it for yourself that you understand how ugly an environment can be when waste or plastic is there. It's the same in Vietnam, and there is a big problem in Vietnam because the mainstay of the diet is fish, and the amount of rubbish and landfill that's been just dumped in the sea and into the rivers is appalling, and it will eventually pollute and create real dangers as it enters the food system. The problem seems to be regulations.
You're right there, but it's a very, very complicated business. I mean, each country has their own agency which monitors these things. For example, here in England, it's the EA, the Environment Agency, and they're allowed to inspect, investigate and prosecute a company if it breaches environmental guidelines. Elsewhere in Europe, it's slightly different. For example, in Italy, the Carabinieri have a specialised team that deal with environmental crimes, and they have investigative police powers, as does SEPRONA, the Nature Protection Service, which is part of the Spanish Civil Guard in Spain.
And all power to their elbows, because, let's give them as much power as they need. You mentioned the Environment Agency, though, and they do a pretty good job.
Companies do get in trouble. You may have heard of Biffa or seen their trucks. They're the second largest recycling company in the UK. Back in 2019, the company was fined £350,000 for trying to send household rubbish to China as paper fit for recycling. Environment Agency inspectors found that the bales contained nappies, wet wipes and condoms. Really, really not pleasant. I did try to contact them to find out more about what happened, but no one was available for an interview. Interestingly, Simon Ellin, our friend from the Recycling Association, has some sympathy for Biffa. They run a huge operation and there are so many different people involved.
I think when you actually end up in a court because of alleged illegal exports, in terms of somebody that's the size of Biffa, then something somewhere along the line has gone wrong. They're just one cog in the wheel, and it's whole supply chain responsibility that's at fault here. One of the things that the jury found was that there were unacceptable levels of nappies in the material that had been exported to China. But the problem Biffa faced is the facility that it came from receives 7 million nappies per year through that facility. Who's regulating that? Are the local authorities culpable? I think they are, for allowing the public to put the nappies in the bins, in the recycling bins, and for them to end up in the recycling process, because they are paper-like in nature and they're very difficult to sort.
Why were people putting nappies in their recycling? That's laziness. And what Simon's saying is that with this case, Biffa weren't entirely to blame, and that local authorities and the public must accept some own responsibility for their actions. The regulation is there, but of course, trying to get people to change their habits is a different matter.
Yeah, the regulation is there in most countries at least. We even have an international agreement on this. The Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal. It's quite a mouthful. It was first signed in 1989. And to find out what all of it means, I spoke to Dr. Vittoria Luda de Cortemiglia, who works at the UN and is an expert in illicit trafficking and transnational waste.
So the Basel Convention is this international instrument that controls waste shipments across countries, and it forbids a number of shipments of hazardous waste.
As of this year, there has been a new amendment. Dr. Luda de Cortemiglia told me that it will improve the way we export and monitor plastics, which up until now have been moving around fairly freely. It will basically mean that there will be a new notification system between countries for the less recyclable plastic, so that it doesn't end up in the wrong hands or in landfills or in the ocean.
Well, that obviously sounds like a move in the right direction. International rules to stop people moving nasty, toxic rubbish around. What kind of punishments do people face if they do break the rules?
Well, that will vary. Any company breaking the law will end up in court in the country of jurisdiction. I have to say, if you told me there was such a thing as waste criminals and rubbish bandits, I'd have said you were describing a bad Pixar movie. But it's real. And Dr. Luda de Cortemiglia told me that some of the people breaking these export rules don't even realise they're doing it. They think they're saving money for their companies or their governments. but they're getting involved with some really nasty characters without realising it, the rubbish bandits. So she told me about a case she worked on recently in the Canary Islands.
I can provide you an interesting case of June 2020, where an organized crime group was dismantled by the Guardia Civil in Spain with the support of Europol and a Carabinieri from Italy. This group was involved in illegally moving hazardous waste from the Canary Island to several countries in Africa. People that have been arrested were suspected of document fraud to carry out these illegal shipments. The criminals would load maritime containers with second-hand items like vehicle parts, household goods, but also a large amount of electrical waste that should not be sent across countries. And the investigation was then carried out by the Spanish with the support of other countries, namely Italy, but also Europol, and also in collaboration with African countries. So this is a case that shows how unfortunate these type of crimes involve different countries from different regions, and also therefore are sometimes very challenging to be detected.
It sounds as though waste crimes are difficult to crack down on and penalise because there are so many players.
It's incredibly complicated. Some good news on the UK front about regulations. The Recycling Association is trialling tracking technology which can track compliant recyclable material right to the end destination using GPS technology, whether at home or abroad. But has any of this sort of changed your mind about banning the export of waste?
No.
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 Again,
I don't think it has, if I'm honest.
I'm wasting my time, Stephen.
No, you're not, because you've drawn attention to some really serious issues. But I don't see the problem about exporting it, but only with a caveat, of course, if it's properly regulated and the people who are disposing of that waste are responsible people. And police, like the police in Spain you talked about, are cracking down on the people who are just dumping, the fly tippers, if you like. I can't really envisage a time when we're not going to have to export at least some of our waste from richer countries to poor countries, because richer countries, by the very nature of being richer countries, consume more. I think the important thing to do is as cleanly as possible and have good regulations in place to make sure it doesn't get dumped or burned. And also, companies that produce waste should be liable, especially fast food companies. They should be penalised or they should be taxed for the rubbish they cause on streets. Ultimately, waste is a business, just like everything, and the market hopefully will resolve itself.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I guess the idealist in me would like to see the UK building more state-of-the-art facilities and recycling more of its own waste. And I would like there to be more awareness campaigns so that we, the public, can reduce and even eliminate the amount of waste we produce eventually.
And I totally agree with you there. We've come to an agreement, Mhairi.
Amazing.
It is.
We can end the podcast.
Okay, well, in that case we will. We're hoping you, our audience, will get in touch and tell us what you think. Do you think countries should be banned from exporting their waste? Let us know. And if you have a question you would like answered, we'd love to get to the bottom of it and answer your question on the next episode of the Answers Project. The clue's in the title. Find us on CGTN Europe's Facebook or Twitter page. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher or Spotify. And thanks very much for listening.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.